The story of slavery is a well-known chapter in history, filled with tales of the transatlantic slave trade, forced labor, and the inhumane treatment of men, women, and children. Eventually, the abolition of the slave trade in the early 19th century brought an end to this dark period. However, what many people are unaware of is that the abolition of the slave trade gave rise to a new and even more sinister aspect of slavery: sex farms and slave breeding farms. The primary objective of these farms was simple yet horrifying: to produce more slaves. With the importation of slaves from Africa no longer possible, slave owners turned to breeding their slaves like animals. They carefully selected which slaves would mate with each other based on physical attributes, health, and even intelligence, aiming to create the strongest and most profitable offspring. These slave breeding farms were scattered throughout the southern United States, with estimates suggesting that as many as 70 of them were in operation during their height. Wealthy plantation owners often ran these farms, viewing slave breeding as a lucrative business opportunity. However, the horrors of these farms extended far beyond the breeding itself. In some cases, plantation owners established sex farms where slaves, particularly young girls, were forcibly subjected to sexual activity with other slaves, or even with the plantation owners themselves. The resulting offspring from these forced encounters were also seen as profitable commodities and were frequently sold at auctions to the highest bidder. The true extent of these practices is challenging to ascertain, as records were often destroyed or deliberately hidden. Nevertheless, it is estimated that thousands of slaves were compelled to participate in these breeding programs, leading to countless atrocities and human rights violations. Acknowledging the brutality and inhumanity of slavery in all its forms is vital, despite the discomfort it may cause. By revealing some of the most horrific facts about slave breeding and sex farms in the United States, this video aims to shed light on this dark chapter in history. Remember to subscribe to this channel for more content like this. Breeding machines. One of the most disturbing facts about sex farms during the era of slavery is the dehumanizing view of enslaved women as mere breeding machines. Plantation owners and overseers regarded these women as a means to produce more enslaved individuals, thereby increasing their own wealth and power. The desires and consent of these women held no significance, as they were forced to engage in sexual relations with multiple men. This reprehensible practice was particularly prevalent in the Deep South, where the climate and soil were ideal for cotton cultivation. Enslaved women on these plantations endured brutal physical and sexual abuse, with no possibility of escape or seeking justice. They were regarded as property rather than human beings, and their bodies were treated as such. Forced breeding was not limited to the Deep South alone. It was also widespread in other regions of the country, including the Chesapeake Bay Area and the Upper South. Plantation owners in these areas similarly saw enslaved women as a means to augment their wealth and power, exploiting them accordingly. Historical evidence documenting the forced breeding of enslaved women can be found in various sources, often contain references to enslaved women designated as breeders or breeding stock. These records provide details such as the number of children produced by these women, their age, health, and other pertinent information. Moreover, numerous slave narratives further illustrate the experiences of enslaved women who were coerced into breeding. One such narrative is that of Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman from North Carolina in the mid-19th century. In her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs recounts the horrifying reality of being compelled to engage in sexual relations with her owner for the purpose of bearing children. Female slaves were forced into relationships. During the period of American slavery, the sexual abuse of female slaves was an extensively prevalent and disturbing practice. Slave women not only endured forced labor, but also faced the horrors of sexual exploitation at the hands of their owners and overseers. This abhorrent behavior was not confined to a particular region or plantation, but was widespread throughout the American South. The earliest evidence of sexual abuse of female slaves can be traced back to the transatlantic slave trade. These women were often captured and subjected to grueling journeys across the Atlantic, enduring cramped and unsanitary conditions. During this passage, they suffered sexual abuse at the hands of crew members and other male slaves. Once in the American South, female slaves faced even more sexual abuse. This abuse manifested in various forms, including rape, forced sexual relationships, and prostitution. Owners and overseers, exploiting their power and authority, coerced slave women into these sexual relationships. These encounters were often violent and non-consensual, resulting in many slave women being impregnated against their will. The children born from these forced sexual relationships were not recognized as the offspring of their fathers, but were considered the property of their mother's owners. Consequently, these children were also enslaved and could be bought, sold, or traded like any other commodity. This practice was particularly common in the Upper South, where slaves were bred for sale to the Lower South. One notorious example of this practice is the story of Sally Hemings, a slave woman owned by former U.S. President Thomas Jefferson. Hemings was coerced into a sexual relationship with Jefferson and gave birth to 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Although Jefferson did not acknowledge these children as his own during his lifetime, DNA evidence has since confirmed their paternity. Another profoundly distressing case of sexual abuse is that of Celia, a slave woman owned by Robert Newsom in Missouri. Newsom repeatedly raped Celia, and when she became pregnant, he refused to recognize the child as his own. In an act of self-defense, Celia killed Newsom. However, she was unjustly tried, convicted of murder, and ultimately hanged. This case serves as a harrowing testament to the brutal reality of sexual abuse and violence that many slave women endured in the American South. If you are enjoying the content so far, then consider liking the video and subscribing. Slave offspring were sold at birth. During the era of slavery, the practice of separating families was distressingly widespread. Enslaved children being torn away from their parents was a tragically common occurrence. However, on sex farms, this heart-wrenching practice was particularly prevalent. Enslaved women who were subjected to forced breeding were often impregnated by men who were not their husbands or partners. Consequently, the children born on these sex farms were not regarded as part of a cohesive family unit. Instead, they were treated as products to be sold for profit. Historical records reveal that many plantation owners viewed the sale of enslaved children as a lucrative business opportunity. The price of an enslaved child varied depending on factors such as age, gender, and health. Generally, children were sold at higher prices than adult enslaved individuals. This was because they represented potential future laborers and breeders, with the capacity to generate greater long-term profit. Enslaved children were frequently sold at public auctions, where they were forcefully separated from their mothers and other family members. These auctions were deeply traumatic for both those being sold and those left behind. Enslaved individuals wailed, moaned, sobbed, and screamed, desperately reaching out for their children, parents, or loved ones being cruelly taken away from them. Historian Edward E. Baptist vividly describes the emotional anguish families endured during these separations in his book, The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Enslaved people experienced immeasurable pain, with the echoes of their cries lingering on the auction platforms. The separation of families on sex farms inflicted lasting wounds on those involved. Slave breeding continued even after the abolition of slavery. Even after the abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, the dark practices of slave breeding and sex farms persisted in certain regions of the United States. While the amendment officially ended slavery, it did not explicitly prohibit the continuation of slave breeding or the sexual exploitation of former slaves. Tragically, evidence suggests that these inhumane practices continued in some parts of the South well into the early 20th century. The persistence of slave breeding and sex farms can be attributed, in part, to the fact that many former slaves remained on the same plantations where they had been enslaved. They continued to endure exploitative and abusive conditions under their former owners. Thus, the power dynamics and patterns of control that facilitated such practices were perpetuated. One well-known case of post-abolition slave breeding took place in Natchez, Mississippi, between the late 1860s and the early 1900s. Wealthy white planters in the area engaged in a disturbing system known as the fancy trade. In this system, they would buy and sell young, light-skinned African-American women who were specifically bred for their physical appearance and sexual appeal. These women, referred to as fancy girls, were often the daughters of mixed-race slaves. They were put up for auction and fetched exorbitant prices. Once purchased, they were forced into sexual relationships with white plantation owners and their male guests. Tragically, their own children resulting from these relationships were frequently sold back into the slave trade. In addition to the fancy trade, reports also surfaced of forced sexual relationships between white plantation owners and their former female slaves. The continuity of abuse was facilitated by the fact that many former slaves continued to reside and work on the very plantations where they had been enslaved. They remained vulnerable to ongoing mistreatment and were often subjected to the same patterns of abuse and exploitation. As we reflect upon the horrific realities of slave breeding and sex farms, it becomes clear that the abolition of slavery was only a starting point in the long and arduous journey toward true freedom and equality. These practices, rooted in the dehumanization of enslaved individuals, persisted well beyond the legal abolition of slavery, inflicting further pain and suffering on generations of African Americans. Confronting these uncomfortable truths is essential in acknowledging the depths of cruelty and systemic injustice that marked this dark chapter of history. By shedding light on these forgotten narratives, we honor the resilience and strength of those who endured unimaginable hardship, while reminding ourselves of the imperative to combat all forms of oppression and ensure a more just and equitable future for all. Thanks for watching the video. And if you found it informative, please like and subscribe to Time Capsule for similar content. We look forward to sharing more knowledge with you in the future. Until then, take care.